Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Roadmap to Freedom. We are at the 13th session of the project. We'll be concluding our first subject, Golden Rule, and move to another. How can we use the scientific method to determine which is the correct view? Let's take, for example, the trilogy again. How can you use the scientific method to determine which is the correct view? Stealing is always right, stealing is always wrong, and stealing is sometimes right and sometimes wrong. If you could do that, what would that imply? You have figured out how to apply the scientific method outside of physics. Galambos figured this out. If Newton had not integrated the physical sciences, there wouldn't be a crisis. Because see, you can go on indefinitely trying to kill people off with bows and arrows and spears, but how many people can an outstanding spear thrower kill in one day? 100 people. You know, if one man can with a spear kill 100 people on one day, that's impressive. And yet it's not good enough. The people procreate too fast. However, when one man can push a button and wipe out 100 million people, then you have the leverage to destroy the species. So once you integrate physics, you must soon integrate volition, or it's goodbye and good luck. How can we use the scientific method to determine what is the correct definition of stealing? How do you know that one is any good if you can have any number of definitions of stealing? How do we know, for example, that this is a useful definition of property when you can have an infinite number of definitions of property and not two alike? These are questions we will answer soon. If it is observable that the only way in which you can enslave an individual is to take away his primordial, primary, and secondary property, and if freedom, whatever it is the opposite of slavery, then does it seem reasonable that freedom could possibly have something to do with the protection of individuals' primordial, primary, and secondary properties? Could freedom have something to do with securing the derivatives of the individual's life? I mentioned earlier that everyone will claim to be for freedom, but what do most people mean by freedom? Freedom, the most people, represents the condition that will exist when their own views prevail all over others. This is not Professor Galambos' definition of freedom. His definition of freedom is a derivative of his definition of property. Freedom is a societal condition that exists when every individual has full 100% control over his properties. One of the most common reactions to this definition of freedom is this concept of freedom would be impossible to attain. Now, whether or not freedom, as it is defined, is utopian or attainable, possible or impossible, is not a subject we right now discuss. However, I will return to this very important subject later in the session when I will make a precise distinction between the practical versus utopian, the possible versus the impossible. Without a discussion on the subject, whether this is possible or impossible, practical or impractical, utopian, or what have you, without that discussion, you might ask, is this even a desirable goal, let alone the attainable goal? I would like to make a comparison between freedom, slavery, and stealing. I have given you the Galambos definition of freedom, a societal condition that exists when every individual has full 100% control over his own property. Or another way of saying that, when every individual possesses liberty. An individual possesses liberty when he has total control over his primary, and secondary property. When everyone possesses liberty and there is not one slave, then the societal condition is called freedom, not one slave. Let's compare the Galambas's definition of freedom with his definition of slavery. Slavery is control of the individual's property without his permission or consent. How are those related? You can see that those are opposite concepts. That means the means to slavery is stealing, taking away property without the permission of the owner. But is stealing right or wrong? Is slavery right or wrong? What is the right idea versus the wrong idea outside of physics? I will solve those problems during the time we will be discussing our next theme. It is seemingly impossible to solve, at least on any rational or scientific basis. Nevertheless, I will disclose a scientific standard of rightness that not only can determine what's right in physics, but one can determine what is right outside of physics. A standard of rightness that will be applied, ladies and gentlemen, to all knowledge. I realize that you have many questions. You will find most of your questions will be answered in the discussions to come. But since all your questions may not be answered during the regular sessions, we design already the Q&A podcasts. You will be able to ask questions before and during the podcasts. Next talk will be on the subject of right idea versus wrong idea. This is very important, fundamental question. Very often people convince themselves that if they perceive something as good, they can, or sometimes they think must, impose it on others. Instead of not doing to others what we hate ourselves, they do to others what they think is good for us. Next time we will start something detrimental to the whole theory of Galambas. Until that time.